Cass, if there's any one message in the Beatles' collective work, it's love, peace. Am I right?
You are correct, my friend. But at the same time, when the Beatles didn't like something or someone, they weren't shy about offering their opinions.
And that's exactly what we're exploring today.
Sure.
We have this image of them, right? These four polite, charming lads from Liverpool preaching harmony.
Yeah, the mop tops.
The mop tops. But the reality, when you dig into the sources, is, well, it's the opposite. They could be absolutely savage. When they didn't like an artist, they didn't just keep it to themselves.
Oh, no. They named names. They went public and threw shade with the precision of, like, seasoned snipers.
And what's so fascinating is that it wasn't just random pettiness. It was, genuine artistic contempt. Each one of them had their own specific triggers.
Exactly. John Lennon, he went after phonies and sellouts. Paul McCartney's criticisms were almost always personal about betrayal or ego. And George.
Yeah.
Well, George, the quiet one, he might have had the sharpest tongue of all.
It really gives you a window into their own creative minds. So let's get into it, starting with the man who was maybe hardest on himself and therefore hardest on everyone else, John Lennon.
That's the key right there. John was brutally honest about his own songs. He'd call his own work abysmal or bullshit. So when he turned that critical eye on others, it came from a place of really intense artistic principle.
And his number one target is, I think for many people, pretty shocking. It's Bob Dylan.
It's almost unbelievable. You have to remember, Dylan wasn't just another singer. He was a hero to John. He introduced them to marijuana, sure, but he fundamentally changed how Lennon thought about writing lyrics.
He's the reason they evolved from I Want to Hold Your Hand to something as complex as Norwegian Wood.
He was maybe the only contemporary John saw as a true equal, which is why the betrayal, as John saw it, was so deep when Dylan released his born-again Christian album in 1979, Slow Train Coming.
Right. For John, the outspoken atheist, the counterculture icon, this was just unforgivable.
A total spiritual sellout. And John recorded this long, rambling monologue, just tearing it apart. He didn't hold back at all.
He said Dylan wants to be a waiter for Christ. I mean, that's just devastating. He called the band mediocre, the singing pathetic.
And the lyrics just embarrassing. It wasn't just a bad review. He was basically saying Dylan had abandoned everything that made him great. He traded revolution for religion.
And he had a similar kind of disdain for the whole folk revival scene, right? The very earnest, clean-cut folk singers.
Oh, absolutely. He famously said, I never liked the fruity Judy Collins and Joan Baez and all of that stuff.
That word fruity is so loaded.
It is. Because for John, coming from working-class Liverpool, he had this built-in detector for anything that felt pretentious. He saw artists like Baez and Collins as middle-class people kind of cosplaying as the working class.
Bourgeois guilt dressed up as authenticity?
That's the perfect way to put it. And that leads right into his other target, the band Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
Okay, so part of this might be a little Grammy saltiness because their album won the Grammy that Abbey Road was nominated for.
There's probably a bit of that. But the real issue for John was much deeper. He saw them as the absolute antithesis of what rock and roll should be.
They were too slick, too professional.
Exactly. They were technically amazing musicians, but in John's eyes, they were soulless. They took the raw, rebellious energy of rock and polished it, sanitized it with, horn sections and jazzy arrangements. Corporate rock dressed up with horns. The enemy. For John, if it wasn't raw and honest, it was phony. And he hated phonies more than anything.
So if John's criticisms were about artistic honesty, Paul McCartney's were a lot more. It runs deep.
And it almost always stems from a sense of betrayal or a slight to his, let's say, considerable ego. And the biggest one, the one that lasted for decades, involved Michael Jackson.
You have to set the scene. In the early 80s, they were real friends. They recorded huge hits together like Say, Say, Say.
And Paul, being the savvy businessman he was, even advised Jackson on how valuable it was to own music publishing rights.
Which makes what happened next just so brutal.
In 1985, Jackson turns around and buys the ATV catalog, which held the rights to most of the Beatles songs. He literally outbid Paul for Paul's own work.
Paul's public comment on it was so perfectly British in its understatement, he called it dodgy.
Which is basically code for backstabbing traitor. He said, you don't become friends with someone and then buy the rug they're standing on. The friendship was over instantly.
And it shows you what matters to Paul. Loyalty and, I think, control. He lost control of his life's work to a friend.
And that ego we mentioned, it pops up in other places. like his comments about Madonna in a 2015 book.
Right. He said he resented how she was treated like a goddess and everyone else was just the sorry people.
Which is, I mean, irony is incredible, isn't it? Paul McCartney complaining that someone else is getting too much attention.
It just shows that competitive fire never really went out. But the most savage Paul moment has to be the Phil Collins story.
Oh, it's just brutal. So it's a Buckingham Palace event in 2002. Phil Collins, who's a huge star himself, goes up to Paul to get a Beatles book signed.
And Paul turns to his then-wife Heather and says,
He says, "Oh, Heather, our little Phil's a bit of a Beatles fan."
Little Phil. Ouch. Collins said he was just crushed. He said, Paul has this way of making you feel small, like, I know this must be hard for you because I'm a Beatle.
It's just pure condescension, masks his charm. And finally, with that same sort of dismissiveness, he took a shot at Oasis,
who basically worshipped the Beatles.
Right. And Paul's takedown was simple, but lethal. He just called them derivative. For an artist, that is the kiss of death. He was saying, you're not creating anything new, you're just copying me.
Which brings us to George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, the spiritual one. But his criticisms, they were the most direct and honestly the most brutal.
George didn't care about your feelings. If he thought your music was bad, he just said it. For him, it wasn't about phoniness like John or betrayal like Paul. It was about craft. It was about musical skill.
And his most stunning target has to be Neil Young.
I mean, who doesn't love Neil Young? He's a rock icon. But in a 1992 interview, George was asked what he thought of him.
And his response was immediate, no hesitation.
He just says, I'm not a Neil Young fan. I hate it. Yeah, can't stand it. It's good for a laugh.
He even mocked his guitar playing and said he and Eric Clapton used to look at each other during a show and just agree that he was terrible.
And that's George's whole philosophy right there. George was a meticulous, highly disciplined guitarist. He valued technical precision. He saw Neil Young's raw, emotional, sometimes sloppy style, not as authentic but as unprofessional. A joke.
He applied that same logic to Elton John, too.
Yeah, he dismissed Elton's entire career in one sentence. He said, it all sounds the same. His music is made to a formula. Throw in lyrics, throw in 4 chords, shake well, and there it is, the new Elton John super hit.
He's basically calling him a hack. A very successful hack, but a hack.
Exactly. Because for George, music was a spiritual pursuit. He saw Elton John as a showman making music for money, which just offended his artistic sensibility.
My favorite George takedown, though, was aimed at the Hollies after they covered his song If I Needed Someone.
He hated their version. He called it rubbish. But then he delivered the ultimate George Harrison insult.
This is it. This is the one.
He said, they sound like session men. Technically good, yes, but that's all.
That last part. But that's all. That means you have no soul. You can play the notes, but there's no feeling, no artistry. That, for George, was the worst thing you could be.
And you see the same thinking when he dismissed the whole punk movement, the Sex Pistols. He said they were just rubbish, no finesse in the drumming, just a lot of noise and nothing.
Coming from the guy who helped craft the complex soundscapes of an album like Sgt. Pepper, you can see why he'd reject the deliberate chaos of punk. For him, a lack of discipline was a lack of art.
If you couldn't play, you weren't worth his time. Simple as that.
So we have John, Paul, and George. But we have to mention the big exception here, which is Ringo Starr.
Ringo really just wanted peace and love. He's the one Beatle who didn't seem to have public feuds with other artists. His sharpest criticisms were always saved for things that happened in the studio.
Like calling the sessions for Maxwell's Silverhammer the worst ever.
Right. But he wasn't a competitive songwriter like the others, or a virtuoso defending his turf. He seemed much more secure, just happy to be there. He saw being in the Beatles as this incredible miracle to be enjoyed, not a title to be defended.
And if Ringo's the exception, the final saddest example of their shared contempt has to be Elvis Presley.
Elvis was their hero. He was the reason they started, the template for the whole dream.
Their meeting with him in 1965 should have been this amazing moment, but instead it just showed them how far their idol had fallen.
Lennon was the most blunt about it. He famously said Elvis died when he went into the army. George just said he'd become a joke. They saw him making these terrible formulaic movies like Clambake.
For the Beatles, who fought tooth and nail for creative control, who risked everything on an album like Sgt. Pepper, watching their hero choose commercial safety over art,
it was unforgivable. He'd become everything they swore they would never be. The king had given up his crown, and they just couldn't respect that.
So when you put it all together, what does it tell us? The uncomfortable truth is that they weren't saints. They were competitive and insecure and sometimes petty.
But what makes all this so valuable is the honesty. You just don't get this anymore. Artists today are so media trained, so afraid of saying the wrong thing.
Right. The Beatles just told you what they thought. John called Dylan pathetic. George said Neil Young was good for a laugh. Paul called his friend dodgy.
They weren't afraid to make enemies if they felt artistic integrity was on the line. They refused to be anything but themselves.
And that willingness to be so honest, so unfiltered, to hate openly and not apologize for it.
That might be their most revolutionary legacy, even more so in today's world than their music.
Well, thanks for joining us today. Whenever you feel like knowing more about the Beatles, visit us at BeatlesRewind.com. Every day we do something new there. Song reviews, album reviews, movie reviews, book reviews, documentaries, trivia, all things Beatles. Every day, 8 days a week. You can find us on the website, BeatlesRewind.com. You can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Podcasts, practically anywhere in the inner tubes. The Beatles, all day, every day. Cass will do it again tomorrow.
Absolutely. Talk to you then.
Until next time, when you listen.
Your mind conducts its own symphony.